This is International Master Eric Kislik, and this video is about attacking chess principles and the fundamental ideas that really go into an attack. You probably have had many attacking games yourself where you didn't really know whether an attack would work or not, you didn't really know what to look for. Well, this video will definitely help you in that case. This was a huge problem for me when I started out playing. I would always see these Grandmaster games and go, why did that work? I don't understand. It didn't seem like that was a very strong attack. Well, there are really only two things to think about in judging whether an attack will work or not. The first is focal points. And the first thing you have to think about with respect to focal points is, do I have a specific target to attack? Without a specific target, the attack will not work. The second main point is concentration of force. Do we have enough pieces for the attack to work? So we compare the attacking versus defending pieces in number. The defensive side ideally aims for economy of force in covering his focal points. For instance, we'll be looking at an example where a single knight on e8 defends the king. So we're going to examine 4 attacks, and we're going to think about them from the angle of focal points and concentration of force. And what's interesting is that I think if you don't think about them from this angle, they're going to be very hard to understand. But when you think about them from this angle, they'll probably make perfect sense to you. So I also have one little tip here. If the opponent is one move away from refuting your attack, for example, by bringing another piece into the defense, the position is by definition critical, requiring you to try to find a way to justify your attack. So let's go through these games here. So there was one very famous game, which I want to start with. It was Anand versus Adams. It was played in the FIDE World Championship in 2005. It was one of Anand's best games in his own opinion, and I studied his own analysis on the game. It was a fantastic game, and I remember when I first saw the game, I kept thinking, why did his attack work? I didn't understand. It didn't seem like it was going to be so strong. But let's skip through the opening phase. It was a very long theoretical Ruy-Lopez line where there were a lot of games played in this variation. So there were a couple of World Championship games played between Kasparov and Karpov in this same variation. And they actually reached this position right here. So anyway, knight to d4 was played. Let me just see how many games were played here. 257 games played with queen b6. So a very, very heavily played theoretical position. So black goes knight to e5. Basically, white is aiming for an attack on the king side. He's trying to make something happen over there. And in this case, he's trying to use his rook and bring it over to the king side. So he goes rook to g3. And so he clearly has some targets over here. And black goes g6. So I'm getting us to the critical moment. So white plays knight to f3. So we can already see, just when we're looking over here at the king side, it's very interesting. You can see both of white's bishops are pointed over there. Most of white's pieces are pretty close to the attack, whereas at the moment, black just has a few pieces over here. So, for instance, if knight takes f3 check, queen takes f3, white's attack is going to be very, very strong. Defending h6 will be very, very difficult. So in the game, knight ed3 was a very good move. One of the things that this does is it targets the f2 pawn, but it also shuts out the bishop on b1, meaning it's not a part of the attack. So white just played the move queen to d2. So let's take a look at this position and think about white's attack here, because this was really amazing how white was able to sacrifice a full rook in this game. I remember so many people wondering, I was reading some comments on chessgames.com and some other places, everyone's wondering, why did this work? I don't understand it. Well, if you think about it, and if you look at what white's attack was about, it will make much, much more sense when you think about it from focal points and concentration of force. One of black's problems is the pieces all over here. The queen on b6. For instance, if the queen was over there on the king side, it'd be very hard to make the attack work. The bishop on b7 being out of play, the rook on a8 not really doing that much. So black tried to make something happen in the game with bishop takes d5. So there were some correspondence games played here with knight takes e1. So objectively, this should have only been approximately equal. So knight takes e1, knight takes e1. Rook a1 is the best idea. And I admit this is the most active way to play, basically bringing that rook that wasn't doing much to bear on the first rank. So for instance, if knight takes, bishop takes, queen takes, if black plays the move knight takes d5, white will probably just force a draw here with queen takes, king f8. queen f5 check, and I see most of the games here ended in draws. So unfortunately for white, there's probably only a draw here with perfect play. But let's just look at why the attack worked in the game, and then we'll discuss it from there. So bishop takes d5 was played, and this was a nice tactical idea on the e-file. White decided to ignore everything and just said, all right, I'm just going to go purely for the attack. So knight takes h6 check was played. And part of black's problem is that moving the king doesn't really help because the king is still very exposed. For instance, if king h7, we can just go knight g5 check. So black decided to take on h6 and then take on f2. So bishop takes h6 was played. Queen takes h6. We'll count the material in a second. So queen takes f2 check. King to h2. Knight takes e1. And then white played knight to h4. So let's take a look at this attack here. So we can see white has 4 pieces here, and black actually doesn't really have any pieces near his king. So really only the queen is nearby. So there's really nothing participating in the defense. And in terms of specific focal points, first of all, there's the idea of playing knight takes g6 in some lines, but there's also the idea of playing knight f5 and just trying to mate on g7. So we have a couple of different targets, but for specifically mating, g7 is a very serious problem. So simply due to a lack of defensive pieces, black is severely struggling to defend. So in the game, knight e d3 was played, and here simply knight takes g6. And this was very interesting. So what ends up happening is, so white starts this position with 4 attacking pieces. All of these pieces are nearby. This is the focal point that we want to sacrifice on, and we want to expose the king and basically, see if we can mate. And once we expose the king, the new focal point will be on g7, where we're trying to checkmate. So after knight takes g6, black needed to take the rook so that white wouldn't have the queen and the rook in a battery. And after takes, king f8, queen to f6 check, king g8. White only has 2 pieces left, but notice just how strong that focal point is. So black resigned here, and the reason for the resignation is that another rook is going to be lost, the rook on e8. So if rook a7, we can play queen to g6 check, and then we can take this rook with check. So that was the reason for the resignation. Really an interesting attack. I mean, the big problem black had here was that there were simply no pieces near the king to defend. The problem with g6 and the problem with g7 were very, very serious. So white had 4 pieces here. Yes, black had material. Black was up a rook, but couldn't actually do anything with it. So a very interesting case where the material didn't matter because the attack was just so fundamentally powerful. And it was all based on just using the pieces very effectively and black not having the force to defend his own king. So let's go on to the next game. The next game I want to look at here was the game Bronstein-Curies. And we can start, I'll just play through the opening moves quickly. d4, knight f6, c4, e6. They just had a pretty standard Nimzo Indian. Let me just see where they first left theory. So b6, I think, was a bit rare. Yeah, b6 is the 6th most common move here. So it's a little rare. White went knight ge2, bishop e7, castle. Black decided to take in the center and castle. Yeah, white went for the interesting d5, which has been played in one game here. And black played h6. All right. And white went for bishop c2. And, I mean, the d5 move is very interesting. White's gaining a little bit of space. It's a little hard to believe that black should have too many objective problems here, but probably what black played in the game wasn't so bad. So in the game, black played knight to a6, and white went knight to b5. So this is very interesting. This involves a pawn sacrifice. The pawn on d5 is sacrificed, but the point is white wants to gain the f5 square or be able to utilize the f5 square with the knight. So e takes d5, a3, bishop to e7, knight to g3. So white's up a pawn here, and black decides, black is up a pawn here and decides to take another pawn. So black is up 2 pawns in this position. And I wanted to use this game as an example because I thought it's a perfect example of this whole concept of concentration of force. Because if you look at that knight on a6, these pieces, the knight on a6 and the bishop b7 and the bishop on b7, are really not taking part in the defense. And in this position, white played the move bishop takes h6, which is one of those moves which was considered very shocking and so difficult to understand, and a really incredible move. But we'll be discussing what the best defensive move was and why, because you might be a little confused as to what black should be doing here. So the point is, after bishop takes h6, after g takes h6, queen to d2, if we look at the targets near the black king, we can see that with the queen on h6, there will be problems with both g7 and h7. And that was exactly what happened in the game. And so it turns out that actually taking on h6 exposes black's king too much because of those specific focal points. So what needs to be played here is the simple knight to c5. And what's really interesting is that you might think, I have to calculate so deeply. There must be, I must be based on finding some really incredible combination, but it's actually not. This move is based on really on general principles. We want to bring the knight back to e6. And then when we have the knight over here capable of defending g7, it will be much easier to defend. So in this case, for instance, if knight to f5, I was planning to play just knight to e6. So this is the best way to defend and to be able to use black's pieces over here in order to try to cover key squares. And basically we're covering the focal points. We're trying to cover everything the best that we can, and we're trying to use all of our pieces effectively. So in this case, declining the sacrifice would have been by far the best choice. Whereas in the game, I think he was just very shocked by what ends up happening with the king, because not only is white planning to go queen takes h6, but there's also the idea of just basically swinging a rook in here. So what we end up having over here is, if we can bring the rook in quickly and take on h6, what we'll end up having is 4 pieces attacking and basically just the knight on f6 as almost the sole defensive piece. So knight h7 was played, which was definitely a mistake. And the problem was, look at the position after queen takes h6. By the way, I want to point out one thing. If black tries to defend with king to g7, we can just play knight f5 check. And then the problem here is h6, and simply the mate on g7 is very, very hard to stop. So that's the problem here. Basically, black's best bet, most likely again, is just to try to bring the knight in and maybe even sacrifice the knight back on e4 after white goes rook a e1. So black's in a pretty desperate situation simply due to the power of white's attack and the ability to focus on specific squares while we have 3 attacking pieces and black only has 1 defensive piece. So knight h7, queen takes. And here there's simply no good way to cover h7. So this was pretty tragic. So after f5, white played knight takes f5. Yeah, and here the problem is just the threat of mating. So there's not really a great defense here. And I was thinking if rook to f7, then white can just check and play the move knight b to d6, and then there's this problem here. So this also does not help black. So this will also be winning for white. So after knight takes f5, rook takes f5, bishop takes f5, if we look at the material situation, white is just about on balance now. But if we look at black's king, there's no pawn cover. So with equal material, black is basically losing with nothing to defend. So white still took a bit of time, but we'll just play through the moves and just kind of illustrate what white did here. The main point is that black's king has no pawn cover. So rook a d1, bishop g5. I just move the queen out of the way. Queen f6, and then we have the nice move knight to d6. I think the attack was conducted very well. Queen to g4. Now there are some threats of playing f4 or h4. King to h8, breaking the pin. Bishop e4. Yeah, this turned out to be a useful idea. Basically what white did is just take on c6 and simply take the pawn here and decide to take another pawn. So here white just has a large material advantage. So with those 3 connected passed pawns, black doesn't really have much chance, I was going to say, and very few pieces that can really help out here. So the rook on b8 isn't doing much. The knights are sort of tripping over each other. So white eventually just kept making progress. King h2, knight d4, queen d5, rook e8. Now white brings the knight in with knight h5, knight to e2, knight takes g7, stripping the king even more. Okay, this was a bit desperate. Okay, so queen f3, knight e2, rook h6 check. Okay, and then he finally resigned. Yeah, so if you wanted to play out a few moves, we could checkmate this way. But I wanted to emphasize those points because I think this would be very hard to understand, this bishop takes h6 move, if you weren't thinking about it in terms of the specific focal points to attack and really the fact that black has so few defensive pieces near the king. And again, a lot of that is caused by what's over there on the queen side. So that's exactly what happened in the Anand game too. And it's also important that white needs to do it right away because if white waits, the idea isn't going to work. So here I have a simpler one, kind of relatively simple illustration. If we look at this position here, what's the material count? 2, 4, 6, 2, 4, 5. Okay, so white has an extra pawn and black has an extra piece. Black has all 4 pieces, white has 3 pieces. So white's trying to figure out a way to get to the black king. But the problem is, well, you know, it's not that straightforward to attack the king here. For instance, f5 is probably not good. The bishop on, or the knight on g5 is undefended. But what we can do instead is, in this case, we can just play knight takes f7. And what we do is, this not only targets f7, it also hits the queen, but we're also targeting g6, and this is allowing us to open up the position. So this is a pretty big problem for black, just the f-file right here. And we also have the fact that the king is defending both g7 and g6. So we have the same issue here. Black has seemingly active pieces, but take a look at these pieces over here. The bishop on a8 shut out by the d5 pawn, the knight on b4, the knight on b6, the rook on b8. They're all not really doing very much. And the critical line is, let's say king takes f7, I simply go f5 to continue the attack. And let's say knight takes c2, I can simply take here and then checkmate the king with queen takes g7. So there's simply nothing helping the king out here. So that's the big problem here. There's again nothing helping the king, whereas for white there are at least 4 attacking pieces, arguably 5. So after let's say queen to d7, we can just go f5. And if black plays, and we could actually even play knight to e5, which is a nice move too, just trying to force open the f-file. And so if f5, g5, we can play f6, and this is again winning for white. We're threatening f takes g7 check. So I think from this angle, this move and this whole attack is not that difficult. It's mostly just important the way that you think about it. If you're thinking about it the right way and thinking about attacking from the right angle, actually orchestrating the attack is not so difficult. So let's take a look at one more. Here I have an example of an attack that didn't work, and we'll discuss why this attack didn't actually work out so well. So this game was between Efim Geller and Max Euwe, and it was played in Zurich 1953, one of the most famous tournaments of all time. So what happened here? We have another Nimzo, e3, c5, a3, takes. So we get a typical kind of pawn structure that we often get in openings like the a3 Nimzo. Oftentimes, white will play ideas like trying to advance in the center with e4 after either bishop d3 or with f3. So many games played here. b6, bishop d3 was played in the game. Bishop b7, white played f3. All right, we're still well within theory. 15 games still here. Castle. And the most common move here is just to play e4 straight away. We can castle, nothing wrong with that. Knight a5. So white's just forced to defend the c4 pawn, or at least keep an eye on it. e4 was played. Still some games here, knight to e8. This is a common reaction, and you'll see in the game that the knight actually does an excellent job defending the king in some of the later variations. And one of the ideas in this variation is sometimes black will play f6 because the knight has moved, and sometimes f5 will be played as well. So white goes knight g3, just trying to bring a piece over there. Takes, rook to c8. All right, so here the c4 pawn is targeted. Pretty good idea for white to think about is the move c5. And part of the point here is that white has the bishop pair, and this is the unopposed bishop, which is the most important minor piece on the board when you have the bishop pair. So if black ends up taking there and we take back and let's say play bishop to e3 or play a4, we end up actually having quite an active game. So c5 was the best move here. So take a look at what happens here. So a pawn is sacrificed. White goes pretty much all out for the attack. And let's think about whether this attack should really work. I'm not going to go into so much detail about analyzing the exact moves, just from a general perspective, just from a really general way of looking at the position. Should this attack work? Yes or no? And what you'll see here is, so black just starts with f6, white plays rook f4. So white goes rook f4 and then goes rook h4. Basically puts everything on attacking the h7 pawn. The problem is, what happens when we get to play all of that? Are we going to be winning? Well, let's take a look at what happened in the game. In the game, black played b5, rook h4 was played, queen to b6. All right, so now there are some definite problems. As you can see, there are some tactical issues here. You know, you can see the king is targeted and the a1 rook is undefended as well. So there's some definite problems here. So here white went e5, and one of the ideas was to open up the bishop, but we'll see what ends up happening. So knight takes e5, black exploits the pin and takes the pawn. F takes e6. All right, so now knight takes d3, queen takes d3, queen takes e6. So when you look at white's attack here, there are three pieces attacking, but, well, actually the knight on g3 is not participating yet. So arguably, at the moment, it's just two. So queen takes h7 check, king f7, and bishop h6. So white is trying to pile up on g7, but you'll see what the problem is. It's really not that easy to actually turn this into something. Whereas black's attack is much easier to actually work out, because if we look at the c2 square, white's queen is covering it. So black decided to sacrifice a full rook with the move rook h8. A very surprising and interesting move, extremely challenging move. And after queen takes h8, rook c2 was played. So I looked at the analysis of this game. This actually doesn't win by force. White should be able to keep things covered. I think the best move is d5, and he needs to try to use his a1 rook in the defense as well. And probably with best play, white can manage to hold the position. But it's not really relevant. I was mainly looking at white's attack and why that ended up working. But we're also looking at why does black's attack work here too. So from both of those perspectives, you'll see why this makes sense. So white's attack was actually not that dangerous here, because here there's no threat of mate, and to actually put more pressure on g7 will take quite a while black has tremendous activity. So rook h8 was played, queen takes h8, and now we're free to come to c2 because the queen is no longer covering c2. And now we're targeting g2, so we have some very serious direct threats now. So rook to c1 was played, which was definitely a mistake. The move d5 should have been played. I'm just using this as an illustration. Takes, king f1, and then queen to b3 was a very strong move. And now, when we look at different ways to target the king, the queen is coming in directly. So king e1 was played to try to move out of the way, and then queen f3, and white had to resign. So threat was just to go queen f2 check and mate. So this I thought was very interesting, because from my perspective, when we're looking at white's attack, you might think white's attack is really dangerous, but the simple fact is that it's actually not. Once black plays queen to b6, really with the queen over there, the knight on e8 doing an excellent job of covering g7, the king being able to flee, being able to run away, it turns out that white's attack was really not that strong. In the key variation, white had two attacking pieces, but black had excellent economy of force, and the knight on e8 was able to defend everything. You could say that the king was a defending piece as well, because it was there just kind of covering g7. So in terms of that specific square, black had two defenders, and white had two attackers. So white couldn't really get any very serious threats in this game, and this is one of those cases where a lot of players would have ghosts, really fearing white's attack here. But when we really look at it, it's not that amazing, and black was able to turn this himself into a phenomenal counterattack with that rook h8 sacrifice. So this was really an amazing game, and this was a game that was covered in the Zurich 53 book, analyzed by Braunstein. So a really amazing counterattack, and just kind of a warning, if you're attacking and you're looking at this kind of situation, you need to be sure that your focal point is actually going to do something when you target it, because white went all out on h7. Everything was targeted on h7, then when actually h7 was captured, nothing happened. The king just ran away. The king went to f7, and there's no decisive follow-up. So the big issue here from white's perspective is that this sacrifice was really putting all of white's eggs in one basket. This was very committal. Everything went into the attack. And the problem is, if the attack doesn't work here, then white will probably lose. And the part of the problem here is you have to judge the attack before you go for it. And really, how you're judging the attack is based on focal points and force. And as we saw here, we only had arguably 2 pieces there, and the focal point g7 was quite easy for black to cover, meaning that white's attack fundamentally couldn't really be that strong unless there was a lot of time to pile up pieces, but in this case there simply wasn't. So this was a good example of defense and counterattack, and a good example of why some of these attacks don't work, when the defending side can cover key squares, keep the king in a safe place, and just keep everything under control. I hope that this helps you in your attacking games and in understanding Grandmaster games, because this is really one of the most important parts of chess, and also one of the most fun things in chess, just understanding these amazing attacks and these fantastic games by the top Grandmasters.